Cool. All right. Yeah, I will jump right into it. Hopefully, everybody can hear me well. So, welcome. We are from the Montreal AI Ethics Institute, are helping to define humanity's place in a world increasingly characterized and driven by algorithms. So we'll just do a quick introduction on who we are, our mission and values, our approach, and then Ryan will be talking about the labor market impacts of AI. Alex will be talking about the about ethnography and ethical AI. Miriam will be talking about governance in AI. I will be talking about machine learning security, and we'll leave some time at the end for questions. I'd like to draw your attention to the bottom of the screen. You've got the link to our website where you'll find all of our publications and the work that we do. It's all open source and open access, so we encourage you to take a look at that. If you find the work that we're doing and the presentation that we're doing right now interesting, we encourage you to tweet at us. We always appreciate that. And at the bottom right, you've got the link to our newsletter where we send out weekly summaries of technical and policy research, technical papers, and articles digested in an easy to assimilate format. So we encourage you to sign up and take a look at that as well. So we're basically an international nonprofit research institute where we work on creating tangible and applied technical and policy research in creating ethical, safe, and inclusive AI systems. We already had a brief introduction to who we are. If you're interested, some of our researcher profiles are on that link that is highlighted on your screen now. As we said, our mission is to define humanity's place in a world that's increasingly driven and characterized by algorithms. We are primarily focused on citizen empowerment. We strongly believe that it's important to have everybody equipped and empowered with the right tools, techniques, and knowledge so that they're able to participate meaningfully in shaping technical and policy measures as it relates to the development and deployment of AI. We're heavily biased towards action. We help to put frameworks into practice, and we're really seeking to make responsible AI the norm rather than the exception. We help to create local champions so that they can take some of the work that we do within their communities and organizations, take that work and make it an integral part of their communities. Through the work that we do, through the learning communities that we have at the Institute, through some of the workshops that we host, and in partnering with folks like Marta at AI for People, we help to foster inclusive global participation in these discussions. And finally, as I said before, all of our work is open source and open access, so we encourage you to take a look at that, share that work with your colleagues as well. We really appreciate that. So yeah, without further ado, I guess turn it over to Ryan, talk about the labor market impacts of AI.
Thanks, Abhishek. So this is a quite broad topic, so I want to summarize it in a way that makes it seem really relevant. And the understanding of why you should care about the labor markets of impacts of AI is quite broad, because not only are there risks associated with automation replacing jobs, but depending on where you choose to implement AI in a company stack and what kind of technologies are developed, you have the risk of increasing inequality. And if you don't really take into account the value that workers provide, you also have risks to the companies and the economies themselves by misappreciating the value human workers do and then reducing your productivity in the long run as a result. And I want to give the canonical example of this. The most important or like most salient example is the introduction of ATMs. In the 1960s and 70s, like I show on the image on the left, what bank tellers really did was count cash and update your checkbooks. And that was the main function that took up the majority of their time. If you assume that this is what the value of bank tellers was, the introduction of the ATM would have gotten rid of bank tellers, because updating your account and giving you cash is exactly what an ATM does. However, this was not the most value-add thing the bank tellers did. It's just the thing that took up the majority of their time. And so understanding that there was something else that bank tellers did, which was provide customer service and support, that was not being able to be done as saliently because of the amount of time they had to do this mundane task, helped explain how after the introduction of ATMs, for a lot of labor market reasons, you actually have an explosion in the number of bank tellers. The value that bank tellers now provide to banks is much larger, and so you need to hire more of them. And so this complicated way that automation impacted with an industry will repeat itself with AI, and we have to be aware of that and how that implementation affects it. The next slide, please. And so a good framework to understand is that there is a distinction between a task and a job. And when we're talking about automation or how AI does at human level performance in something, we immediately jump to thinking about the jobs that that AI can do. However, that's not the case. Jobs are an activity composed of many tasks and putting them together. And even the best performing AI, like AlphaGo, performs really well at a task, which is playing two-player perfect knowledge games. That does not mean it can do everything a human player does. It doesn't even have the manual dexterity that the human player uses in moving the pieces, but it does a component task really well. And so we have to understand where tasks fit into job and how the rearrangement of tasks affect jobs on large. And so there's a good framework to thinking about this. Next slide, Abhishek, which is to understand what AI fundamentally does as a task. AI can be framed as a prediction machine, and there's a great book called Prediction Machines by economists Agrawal, Gans, and Goldfarb that goes over this framework, and I think it's a really important framework to consider because we have this thing that called prediction that takes inputs and predicts an unknown output. And that's what AI essentially does. If I show it an image, it predicts the label. If I show it a situation on the road, it predicts what other drivers would do and the payoff matrix associated with this. If I show it a bunch of credit ratings, it will predict whether someone is a good loan applicant. Now, we have learned through the efficacy of deep learning that a lot more tasks than we initially anticipated can be reframed as prediction tasks. However, prediction is not the whole stack of what a company does. And so this little chart on the right under decision tasks shows you all what is associated with a decision. First, you have to have the input. The input doesn't come from the AI. It's fed into the AI. And then the AI produces the prediction. And oftentimes, that prediction needs to be associated with some kind of human judgment. In areas where there's high uncertainty or high risk, we can't just have the prediction run rampant. Take, for example, in loan approvals. Now, there's a lot of companies running in to say that, we can automate the process of approving a loan. But oftentimes, because of the highly regulated environment of the loan industry, what matters more than an accurate prediction is an explanatory one, something that can actually be reviewed by the applicant and has regulatory proof that, you used a causal process. If you don't have that, there's all these liabilities in terms of, unfairness being introduced, and also the risks of gaming the system because maybe the prediction is being made on something that has no causal basis. And this is where, the managerial insight, this judgment really comes into effect. And as prediction rises in value, so do those roles that increase judgment's value. That does not necessarily mean that, low-skilled jobs can be automated and high-skilled jobs where there is more judgment won't be. Actually, there's a lot of judgment in things that we consider typically low-skilled jobs. If you're a construction worker, you make a lot of judgment about how structural integrity matters. But if you're in the middle management position, you actually might be more susceptible because a lot of your tasks may be reduced to just this prediction output. So understanding where this fits in really helps us understand the impacts it will have. Next slide, Abhishek. And so if we want to create beneficial automation, there's a lot of things that we can do to help us frame how AI will fit into a workplace stack. And I focused on two things that are important, which is the manager's role and the technician's role. If you are a manager and you run a company and you're trying to think about integrating AI, you have a really important role in understanding how the integration of a prediction technology fits in with your broader workforce. And you really need to put in a lot of effort to making sure that all the moving pieces fit together. You can't just have a prediction task perform well, and that's saying that you've gotten rid of all the complementary tasks that have made it perform well. Failures to do this have led to all sorts of crises. Like Tesla tried to automate a lot of its Model 3 production, and it ignored the value that human workers had on the margins, and as a result, its productivity was shot. A lot of times where you have these high-profile cases of algorithmic bias, it's because we didn't have the exercise of judgment in the whole stack, and the prediction was just taken at face value. And so managers have a really important role to play there. On the flip side, technicians also have a really important role to play. when you're building an AI, you need to define what the metrics you're trying to achieve are. And for any given task, you need to understand how that task is circumscribed. A lot of this comes from, engaging with the workers who do that task currently, getting that domain expertise and understanding the limits of what your metric can accomplish and all the other things that a worker does to make sure that the end product that they're producing is valuable. And so this kind of stakeholder engagement is really vital for technicians to define proper metrics and ensure that AI leads to beneficial impacts. And with that, I'll finish off the labor impact section and pass it off to Alexandrine.
Hi everyone, so I'm Alex. I'm going to be talking about ethnography and ethical AI. So just a quick definition, ethnography is the systemic study and recordings of human culture, communities, and organization. So ethnographic studies employ a set of methods for understanding the world through observing natural behavior, social patterns, and power dynamics. So they can help assess the social impact of AI technology at all stages, from design to deployment and regulation, by listening and speaking to people on the ground. So today's focus will be on data collection, analysis, and ownership. Next slide, please. So data collection, AI systems are created and used in a flawed and imperfect world, so are the humans that make them, and this is particularly evident during the data collection process. One thing that to keep in mind during data collection is that what people say, what people do, and what people say they do are entirely different things. So in order to ensure diversity in data sets, big data needs to be combined with what is known as thick data, which you can obtain through studying people. So behavioral observations and having a contextual understanding of data collection can help identify where there are structural biases and inequalities, the different cultural identities and form of self-identification of the people in your data set, and especially underrepresented groups, which leads me to my next point, which is missing data sets. So there's a natural human tendency towards what we call a quantification bias. So we trust data to accurately reflect our social world, but we often miss the lack of signal coming from communities outside of our radar. So reasons for missing data sets can vary. Sometimes it's a lack of incentives. The work might outweigh the benefits. Sometimes some elements resist quantification. So if you take a look at the favelas in Rio, you'll notice they're not on Google Maps because they are hard to track down and identify. And there's also benefits to voluntary non-existent. This is particularly the case for undocumented migrants. So next slide, please. This is just a visual representation done by Mimi Onuahu of the sets of missing data sets in the US. So there's often much more that goes under the radar than what we typically assume. So for the next slide. So when it comes to data collection, the next step is data analysis. So can we allow numbers to speak for themselves? And the answer is often no. So as I already mentioned, data sets and data analysis are not objective. They're curations of human design. So ignoring the wider social context and power paradigms can lead to biased results and or models that put vulnerable populations at risk. So elements to consider when doing critically aware data analysis is who is in charge of defining meaning in the results, how much authority do we give to the results, who are we producing the results for, and who is being impacted, and in what condition is data analysis being done. So one example for the last point is beta testing in the 2013 Kenyan election. So AI systems are sometimes tried out on more vulnerable groups in countries with laxer data regulation before being set in place for targeted users. So Cambridge Analytica beta tested its data analysis models during the 2013 and 2017 Kenyan elections before using them in the US and in the UK. So studies later found out that these experiments, ethnographic studies, later found out that these experiments actively disrupted the Kenyan election process during a particularly violent, intense political campaign season and further eroded social cohesion in the country. So taking advantage of a country or a community's data brings me to my next point, which is data ownership. So it's largely on the question of what do data-driven futures look like for communities who suffer from data inequities. And this is closely tied to the notion of data sovereignty. So data sovereignty is the idea that data are subject to the laws and governance structures within the nation it is collected. And then that brings the question of what happens in the case of self-governing nations or communities within countries. So one example that is frequently brought up is indigenous data governance, which entails the right of each nation to govern the collection, the ownership, and application of their data. And it also entails a respect for indigenous forms of knowledge. So data sovereignty is seen by indigenous communities and political activists as a key piece to self-governance, structures and an important pillar of indigenous sovereignty as a whole. So control and ownership over their data gives indigenous people the right to determine who should be counted among them and decide what better reflects their interests, values, and priorities. So one example is the First Nations Information Governance Center, which is an independent institution that conducts culturally sensitive data gathering initiatives like the First Nations Regional Health Survey and the First Nations Regional Early Childhood Education and Employment Survey. And both of these surveys are done through the help of ethnographers and ethnographic observations. So that concludes sort of a very rapid and brief overview of the ways in which ethnography can contribute to learning more about data collection, analysis, and ownership. So with that being said, I'll turn it over to Maria.
Hi, thank you so much. So I also wanted to just give a brief overview of what governance for AI looks like. The reason why governance is so important is because it really, in fact, builds out the frameworks and the governance structures, but also determines AI decision-making models. And we'll see later on in the presentation why these models need to have an ethics-based frameworks and a human rights-based frameworks from the start, and how these models actually determine how AI is going to be commercialized across the globe, but also how decision-making processes both nationally and internationally are going to be determined. So if we could go to the next slide. Amazing. So the first important point that I wanted to bring up was accountability mechanisms. So accountability mechanisms in artificial intelligence really implies the fact that algorithms for decision making don't always make the right decisions, or if they do, as Alex and Ryan mentioned, the people who are making AI sometimes have biases, and that feeds into the actual AI application. So there needs to be accountability mechanisms in order to have safe and risk guard compliance frameworks. So there are a few points within accountability. First being responsibility. So for any AI algorithm system, there needs to be an individual who's in charge of understanding how the system is being built. And also this helps with accountability in terms of who can we hold accountable, which body can we hold accountable if there is risk or a significant negative impact as a result of deploying the AI system. Second is explainability. So there has to be an explanation for why the algorithm system produced the decision that it made, and how people were impacted by those decisions. So really touching on Alex's point, which is data ownership and data accountability, understanding where that data is coming from and who is producing it is important for explainability. Next is accuracy. So as we know, algorithms make mistakes, and that is important to keep in check when keeping about accountability, and understanding the uncertainty regarding AI is important. And that oftentimes when AI is brought into decision-making processes, we can't always determine AI as the final say, but rather it's a tool to understanding decision-making. Next is audibility, and that is about how algorithms need to be a third party, and there needs to be a third party in understanding how these algorithms are actually in play. So it can't just be, for example, a government in the algorithm system, but rather there needs to be another body that's also maintaining check over it. And finally is fairness. So algorithms make mistakes, and we need to understand how biases and discrimination is put into play here. The second important principle is human-centric. So we cannot have AI systems that make decisions alone without a human in the loop. And this means that we need people to be actively involved in AI systems to understand how they make these decisions, but also understanding that AI systems are often a tool. They are not the final say, and having a human-centric approach will allow for ethics to be in play, human rights, and also an empathy-driven approach. And I'll give the case example of the Singaporean government, and that'll be brought forward in another slide as well. They released their national strategy, and part of their national strategy is actually commitment to a human-centric approach and an empathy approach. And I'll explain why this is so important. And finally, open source and accessible. And again, this goes based off of Alex's point on data ownership. These algorithms and AI platforms require a significant amount of data. And to understand where that data is coming from, who is producing that data, and how that data comes about is important for transparency measures, which goes back to accountability, but also understanding are the public able to access this data, and really does that drive innovation? And so open source and accessibility of data for governance is really important. Could we go to the next slide, please? Awesome. So global governance for AI. There's three really big roles or principles here, and global governance deals with norms, policies, law, and allows for collaboration if it's set out from the start. So first is national AI ethics strategies. By countries committing to having an AI ethics strategies, they're able to display what their role is in creating and determining the principles regarding AI, and also will allow for better collaboration. And again, as I will mention on the next slide, I'll talk about the Singaporean government national AI strategy and how they were setting out ethics, human centrism, and empathy as their main principles for artificial intelligence, and why that's so important when collaborating globally. Next is an international compliance framework. One of the bigger issues with global governance on AI is the fact that our international legal framework is not up to date and does not effectively capture the fact that it can't be maintained through international law. And so because of that, the lack of regulatory frameworks makes it very difficult to have global governance on artificial intelligence. And there's so many talks happening around the world with tertiary bodies such as UNESCO, who are speaking about how to create regulatory guidelines for compliance with artificial intelligence. And finally is the ethical procurement of AI. And this is important, especially when it comes to corporate and other stakeholders that are non-governmental. Even when it comes to government collaboration on artificial intelligence, ensuring that there's diversity and inclusion at the design stage, aligning AI with public interest, and risk assessment frameworks will, making that from the start will allow procurement for AI to be more ethical and have a better transparency measure from the beginning. And finally, I would like to end off talking about the Singaporean government national artificial intelligence strategy. And I mentioned it a couple of times, and mainly because of their commitment for an empathy-driven, human-centric approach. And so the Singaporean government released their artificial intelligence strategy, noting the fact that AI ethics is a significant aspect to AI, and that it must be brought upon in the early stages of deployment of artificial intelligence. And it's really similar to the Canadian artificial intelligence strategy, the pan-Canadian AI strategy. And the reason why I reference that is because Canada was one of the first countries around the world to have an ethics-based artificial intelligence strategy. And the reason why the national artificial intelligence strategy for Singapore was so important is because they believe that by setting out an ethics principle-based strategy, it will help the Asia Pacific region in understanding how to collaborate based off of ethics and human rights, but also understanding that there needs to be collaboration at all levels of the government. And really it brings in the three principles that I mentioned on the first slide. So I highly recommend that everybody takes a read for the National Artificial Intelligence Strategy of Singapore. And I would like to end off here and move over to Abhishek.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, so we'll talk about machine learning security in the last few minutes that we have together before opening it up to questions. So machine learning security, when you encounter the term, can mean two different things. So one It can mean the application of machine learning to the domain of cybersecurity, where you can use it to detect intrusions into your software infrastructure, or protect against those intrusions and other applications of ML to the field of cybersecurity. Or it can mean thinking about how to secure your machine learning models from different sorts of attacks. And it's the latter definition that I'm going to be focusing on and talking about with you today. So, I want to motivate it with an example here on why security is important beyond your traditional cybersecurity measures that you might put in place. It's mostly because the use of machine learning in existing software infrastructure opens up new attack surfaces that aren't really covered by traditional cybersecurity measures. So here we're talking about well-adapted principles and standards that are put in place for cybersecurity. For example, if you're looking at securing your cloud infrastructure, there are ISO standards that govern how you can go about hardening the security posture of your cloud infrastructure so that it's secure from traditional cybersecurity attacks. But the use of machine learning exposes these new attack surfaces that aren't covered. And as an example, what you see on in the image on the slide is the addition of little strips of tape to the stop sign, which befuddles a computer vision system on an autonomous vehicle into not seeing this as a stop sign. And that has obvious safety implications for pedestrians, for vehicles, and it's not something that would be covered otherwise, and needs to be thought about quite actively if we are to deploy these machine learning systems in situations where human safety can be at risk. So when we talk about some of these vulnerabilities and attacks, there is a very interesting piece of work that came out of NIST in the United States, which gives you a fairly comprehensive taxonomy and terminology of what's called adversarial machine learning. I list to the left a non-exhaustive list of attacks there in terms of data poisoning, model theft, model evasion, and adversarial examples. So what we saw on the previous slide was an adversarial example because it triggers a misclassification on the end of the system, where the computer vision system on an autonomous vehicle doesn't recognize that it is a stop sign and maybe recognize it as go at 55 miles an hour, which is has obvious implications for pedestrian safety. Data poisoning is when a malicious entity can inject either specially crafted or randomly generated samples to corrupt the learned model that you have in your system, and again, it can lead to misclassification or predictions that are unexpected or outside the bounds of what you thought you had set up your system to perform in. Model theft is basically when you're able to steal the machine learning model by sending in specifically crafted examples that help you to recover what the underlying machine learning model is, and then use that to your advantage as a malicious actor. And finally, model evasion is trying to bypass the machine learning model and trying to elicit a response that would not be the one that is intended from that system. So an example could be a spam filter where you're able to evade the machine learning based spam classifier and slip by a spam email as a legitimate email. So why care about this at all? Why is this important in terms of building ethical, responsible, trustworthy AI systems? Well, if you think about it, really a lack of machine learning security in building these systems will render futile all the efforts that you put in terms of creating responsible AI systems in the first place. An easy example to think about is if you have spent a lot of effort mitigating the bias that you have within the training data sets, and hopefully create a fair machine learning model from that, if I can mount a data poisoning attack and corrupt the learned model, I have rendered useless your efforts in terms of mitigating the bias in your system by virtue of you leaving the door open for me to mount such an attack. And that's why thinking about machine learning security is very, very essential if you're trying to build responsible AI systems. So that's about all I'll say there. And I'll quickly mention that a lot of these topics that we spoke about, all four of us, are covered to a much greater degree in the State of AI Ethics report that we published that covered a lot of the advances that happened in Q2 this year and gives you an easy to digest way to navigate this exponential rise in output in this space. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Also, if you just Google for it, you should be able to find it relatively easily. And I'll stop speaking here and open it up to questions if we have time.
Thank you so much, guys. So thank you very much for this very comprehensive presentation. Like, it really touched on many different and really, really important points. So I know that the call was scheduled to end at 4:15. So we are a bit out of time. We have the next workshop starting in 10 minutes. I shared the link here for all the participants. But indeed, if you guys are up for it, we could take one or two questions if also the people from the Montreal AI Ethics Institute are okay with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's fine by me.
Okay, guys, if there are any questions, post them in the chat, I would say. I see. Okay, we have one question or several questions. We can start with the first one from Lavina. She says, "Thank you for the time, well done. What would be best ways to measure accountability or auditability? For example, the AI Ethics Center should certify companies, persons, or products." So that's the first question. Whoever, yeah.
Oh yeah, I can try to answer that, and then if anyone else from the team wants to jump in, more than happy. I would say one thing or one framework that was proposed by the World Economic Forum was actually risk assessment. So they provided a framework of risk assessment of for stakeholders to understand their impact on society, the way in which the AI platform works within the country, whether it adheres to different human rights frameworks. And so based off of that risk assessment, they have to go through several conversations with the government, and will allow for accountability measures and the design of AI to be constantly developed over time before deployment. So that was a major takeaway from the World Economic Forum on the procurement of artificial intelligence. And I know that is just one of the many ways that accountability is measured and can be, I want to say, accounted for prior to development and deployment of artificial intelligence. But if the rest of the team has an answer to that.
Yeah, if I can just jump in. So one of the best ways to do this, and the biggest barrier essentially, is that the auditability of an AI system requires any enforcement to be qualified to inspect. And that's where the big barrier is right now, which is it's very hard for a government agency, for example, to hire the necessary talent to audit the system. So the big thing that needs to be worked on is actually bringing in technical talent into potential regulatory bodies, either government or private bodies that can provide that auditability. And that enforcement mechanism needs to be developed. And so really that just relies on talented people being in a position to be able to inspect a company's data or AI. Because right now, even if they create a system that's somewhat open, if all the developers that are understanding of it are scooped up by the large corporations, it doesn't really give us any validation that it's open.
Cool. Thank you so much. Maybe we can take a last question, as I would like to leave at least 5 minutes, so at 25, to the participants to have a little break before the next workshop. So I see there is a question from your team. Yes, is there any risk management framework to assess and mitigate AI ethics/risk?
Yeah, I can jump in there. So one of the great literatures to consult on this is something called high reliability organizations. So there's a lot of work been done in risk management for nuclear failure. And that's kind of the most advanced risk management frameworks we have right now. And the principles of HROs are really adaptable to a lot of the organizations that would be using AI presently. And one of the big things about this is it has more of a decentralized reporting procedure. So rather than focusing on rigid hierarchies, what you really do is allow anyone to identify a failure from any point in an organization. And it really preoccupies people with failure. And so what this would do for organizations implementing AI as risk mitigation strategy is when you've deployed a model and it's constantly being used and making predictions and fitting into your company, being able to empower your employees as well as giving them the necessary toolkits to identify mistakes being made and report freely from anywhere in the hierarchy of the organization what's gone wrong allows you to identify and correct for mistakes much more rapidly. And so the literature around HROs is a good starting point.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, guys, I would say then I will stop recording now. Okay.